Imagine getting non-professional developers to think about testing and metrics and change management. It doesn't work very well. So a lot of these user-developed one-off solutions are ticking time bombs.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 125. What is the low-code movement? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. So when we start out with DevOps, what's the first thing that we do, Victor?
Spin up a Kubernetes cluster.
That's the first thing you do, I guess.
Yeah, I'm kidding. What's the first thing we do? Explain devs and ops that they cannot be in separate departments?
That's one thing. That's a people thing, right? Well, that's DevOps. That's part of it. We also talk about the technology. You've already sort of joked about Kubernetes and all the other tools. But process. That's sort of the golden triangle of DevOps is people, process, and technology.
Stop. That's a golden triangle of absolutely everything. Whichever kind of process or the practice or whatever you take, I can say that's a golden triangle. It's absolutely everything. Not only DevOps.
I know, but that's what we're trying to talk about today. But today we do have a guest with us to talk about process automation. We've got Mike Fitzmaurice. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm great, thanks.
At the time of recording, it's still morning. I haven't had any caffeine yet.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, I take that back. I did have a pre-workout drink, but that was 3 hours ago. So it's already out of my system. So that was part of my process this morning. And it's automated because I make it the night before. But what that has to do with DevOps, I don't know. But to you, what is process automation? Because we all think about processes and we think automation. It's like, okay, we're going to use a tool like Jenkins or something else. But what is process automation to you?
Well, I'm glad you used it as a two-word phrase because automation gets a lot of attention these days. Process management is complementary to automation. It's a big subject. Automation happens everywhere. In fact, not automating is a little bit crazy. DevOps depends on both process and automation. The easiest way for me to differentiate between the two is switching from a shovel to a Komatsu or Caterpillar device or something like that to a bulldozer or a scoop. That would be automation. Figuring out where to dig holes and make sure the right holes are drilled in the right place at the right time and so on, that's process. And you need them both. Automation gets more attention these days because there's robotic process automation and there are products out there that make automation a bit more point and click, but we should not forget about process. Obsession with automation is look, I like it, but remembering what to do, and better still, figuring out if what to do could be done better. Should we mix things up, change things, take feedback, improve stuff? That matters to me probably more than automating the individual steps. Because if we have a sequenced checklist that ensures that the right things get done in the right time, if the steps are performed manually, you still have magic. There was a huge change in the United States about 20 years ago in that a lot of accidents in surgical theaters stopped happening because there was a movement in a lot of state legislatures and medical boards to mandate the use of checklists before every surgery. Surgeons hate this. They don't like being second-guessed, but they had to go along with it. And suddenly, making sure the right type of blood was online and there was enough available and The anesthesiologist once again weighed in on how long they can safely keep the patient under, and that they marked the correct leg in case they need to cut off or cut into something. This kind of stuff, to me, is process management. This kind of stuff to you would be steps in ensuring that code gets written properly, deployed properly, monitored properly, updated properly, sent to the right people for testing before you roll it out to everybody properly. DevOps is a process. Lots of things are processes. Making sure the right things happen is, to me, just as important as making sure those things happen without human intervention.
I would go even further and say that attempts to create automation that were not done as part of trying to automate parts of the process are most of the time a failure. In a similar way as trying to write tests for the code that was written without having tests in mind are usually useless, right? Otherwise, you're talking about two things that are completely not, I was about to say decoupled, that wouldn't be the word, but that were not thought through together. Whenever I meet people and they tell me, okay, so I have a bunch of those 57 different commands and scripts that we are running in random places, random occasions, and what's or not. Can we now create a automated process out of those scripts, because we already have automation of every single step? Usually the answer is not without a lot of rewriting, because you really did not take into account the process itself, what you're trying to accomplish. And what you're trying to accomplish is not a specific step. Specific step is a part of something. If it's not a part of something, then it's a random thing. I can just jump right now, and whether me jumping helps you or no, it's a completely different question, right?
And to me, one of the beautiful things about the whole DevOps movement is that essentially it took development and it took infrastructure, it brought them together, and it wrapped the whole thing in a process. And it ensured that, essentially everybody was focused on a set of common goals. The process is designed towards making sure that not only is software constructed well, but it's constructed with the notion of deployment, that metrics are part of the process to ensure that we can check to see whether or not things are behaving properly, and that we have processes and policies and procedures in place to deal with anomalies to make sure that total throughput of the system is not disrupted. This stuff matters. So process is good. Now, paradoxically, so many business process management systems out there don't think about process in terms of actually putting together and delivering applications themselves. In other words, I might write a business process solution, but I'm not thinking like a DevOps person as I create that solution. Whether I'm doing the thing with code or even worse, doing it with low-code tools. Low-code's big. The world of low-code has exploded, especially in the last 2 years. The thing is, most of the world of low-code has never heard of DevOps and isn't set up to do... Look, if you don't use DevOps tools that are well established, I get that. It's a different set of stuff. The problem is you still need to think in terms of DevOps, even if you're living in low-code land. And just about everybody doing business process automation, digital process management, they're using low-code tools. They don't think about change management, let alone automatically collecting the right kind of metrics, let alone having stuff in place in order to deal with avoiding disruption. And it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, you guys have been fighting this battle for a long time in a world of code and getting not only developers, but infrastructure people to not just work together, but think a different way. To me, you're doing God's work, but the kind of stuff that you've struggled so hard to get people to get, the low-code world, most of that world doesn't get it. I'd like to think my company's far ahead, but, there's room for improvement on everyone's front.
Yeah, I mean, the tools are usually not the problem. And I don't even like using the word DevOps, because I think that it's just a new term for something that is being repeated over and over and over and over again. And companies still cannot get it. And the message is very simple. You cannot create things in isolation. That's the whole message of DevOps. Now, by DevOps, we mean isolation between developer and ops, and Agile before we meant isolation between management and developers and testers. We might come up with different terms to cover different groups, but the essence of it is you cannot do things in isolation. And if you look at, let's say, a process, let's face it, many people hate processes in their companies. They say, I really, really hate this. Just like doctors in your example might have disliked checklists. And the reason why they hate it is because some person sitting in an ivory tower created a process that does not fit the organization as a whole. It fits a group, a department.
Yep. Here's the empathy-free, imagination-free example of this. I don't know a single company where they love their expense management system or leave request system. There's almost always room for improvement. It's because they were set up by accounting without thinking about people that actually have to use it.
Yeah, don't mention it. You have no idea how much I hated. I mean, until a few years ago, until the company started using Expensify, expenses were one of the most hated things in my life. I was traveling a lot, and I would spend sometimes weeks or months even abroad, and then I would need a full week to satisfy some accountant and potentially do the more work myself than if I just deliver the raw material to him and say, okay, do it.
Correct.
Because that accountant designed the system not to help me, he designed it to help himself because he designed it. His process is helping him, not the company.
Correct. Total throughput of the system was not the issue. Optimization of one part of it was, and that's the wrong mindset. The world of low code, and I've spent a long time in that world, tends to focus 95% of its energy on the actual building phase of something. It doesn't focus on the envisioning and resource gathering part very well, a little bit, but not so much. Actual deployment, barely. Change management, almost none. Again, WebCon's actually obsessed with change management in a good way, but it's a small number of companies that get it on this front. But there are lots of good companies that have figured out how to make it easy to build something without writing much code. Some of them attempt to target amateurs, citizen developers. Many more of them focus on targeting professionals and just helping them build stuff more quickly than they could by strictly writing code. But in the process of doing that, pardon the pun, they left out the process part. They focused on nothing more than building the application, and once it's done, it's usually a one-and-done thing. God forbid you should need to collect data or test the thing, or monitor it, or adapt to changes when not just, let's say you did it right, the world's going to change. You're still going to need to modify your solutions on a very regular basis, even if you're really good at your job. Even if you have the best, most open, responsive users in the world will keep changing. You're going to need to adapt constantly. And if you don't have a process in place for pushing a code-based solution or a low-code-based solution, you're messing up.
So now that you mentioned low code, I must ask something mostly because it's my ignorance. My connections with low code were like 20 years ago, or we didn't call it low code, but
rapid application development.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, let's say something like that, right? I'm not sure whether it falls into some same category. In my head, somehow it does, mostly because I don't know what's going on right now. So my question is kind of what changed in that area? It's obviously extremely popular, and I always saw the need for it because, let's face it, developers spend 80% of their time doing actually repetitive monkey bird in a way. I'm writing getter-setters type of stuff. But what changed in is it simply that it's more mature and that makes it really, really attractive now and not 20 years ago when I was playing with it?
There's a greater need to build more applications. I don't want to blame everything on the pandemic. That would be cheap. But the pandemic did have an influence on this. In other words, a lot of stuff needed to get built quickly because the way people were working changed. So it's not so much that low code was magic, but low code helped people build new solutions more quickly than formal development would. So a lot of stuff has been built in the past 2 years. A lot of stuff has been built in the past 2 years that's going to need to be fixed. Already needs to be fixed, but it's really going to will need to be fixed soon. Most of the low-code systems that were used in order to save a ton of time on construction didn't factor in fixability or adjustability or evolvability, and that's a little bit on the tragic side. I mean, even pushing I don't want to pick on particular products, so I'm trying to avoid naming things, but there are small boutique shops that have created very nice environments for building low-code solutions, and then there are major software companies that are pushing tools. Most of them have no clue what to do once a solution is out there. In fact, I'm forgetting the name of the title, but you had a podcast a little while ago, or maybe it was something one of you wrote about more monoliths or something to that effect would not be a horrible thing. And I kind of agree with that. Oh yeah, we need more silos, not less. That's it. And yeah, I know you were being, cheeky about the whole thing, but where I'm going with this is, if you're building a low-code solution with a lot of individual moving parts loosely coupled together, you can pull on one of them and the whole application can unravel if you're not careful, if you haven't thought about the process of connecting everything together. Low-code solutions that involve a lot of discrete components sort of loosely linked together to quickly snap something, those are the most vulnerable to any kind of change being introduced, because they haven't thought through what happens when one of those components needs to be updated. What else is going to be affected by it?
True. I mean, you probably don't need the word low-code there. I think that is happening everywhere.
I'm just saying that at least professional developers, coders, have been exposed to these ideas on a regular basis by a movement of people, like I said, doing God's work, in my opinion, espousing a different way of thinking, let alone a different way of doing things. But it's not like they haven't had the opportunity to hear a lot of good ideas. People that spend all their time doing low-code work, I think they've heard of DevOps, but they're really not sure what it is. And they certainly don't practice it.
I always kind of imagined it differently because I thought that, it's a new area, potentially full of fresh new startups with people who are usually traditionally experienced and have the ability to avoid mistakes of big guys.
I think there are a lot of people trying to do the right thing. There are a few people really doing the right thing. Again, I'd like to think WebCon's one of those companies, and they're not the only low-code company I've worked for over the years. But what I will say is, again, it's not that little startups or even skunkworks areas within large companies aren't doing clever things. They are. They've just focused on the most obvious part of putting together a solution, i.e., how quickly can we build it? And maybe making it easier and easier, trying to reach out to non-professional developers. And there are basically two timeless problems going on out there. One is a backlog of requests for building solutions. Demand exceeds supply. So trying to increase the number of people, you can either change your tools, change your processes, or change your people. And if you expand the pool of people that can build a solution, maybe we can get more built. That's one motivation for low code, appeal to amateurs. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just mean people whose day jobs are not writing or building solutions. So something you do as a sideline. Citizen developer is the term that comes up a lot. It's derived from citizen soldier. So in other words, someone who's part of the company, rank and file, but can, instead of picking up a gun to defend the country, they pick up an IDE to quickly build a solution. You certainly don't want those people touching code, so low code becomes really important at that point. But the other problem is the stakeholder developer disconnect. In other words, I tell you what I want, you build what I said I wanted, but it turns out to be exactly what I asked for, but not what I want. Or you don't really understand the motivation behind what I said, and so you made assumptions I wasn't explicit about. And again, you built something that doesn't actually work for me. And in that role, I'm playing the role of stakeholder, you're in the role of developer. Nobody's bad at their job. It's just a communication problem. So one way to solve that communication problem is to focus on the communication problem. A way to sort of bypass it is to let the person with the need for an application build it themselves. If you do that, okay, great. But again, you have a hard enough time getting developers to do the right thing, right? Imagine getting non-professional developers to think about testing and metrics and change management. It doesn't work very well. So a lot of these user-developed one-off solutions are ticking time bombs. Someone's going to need to fix it. IT's going to get involved. In many cases, they're doing so already. We'd like to see low code factor in this stuff as naturally as forward-thinking professional developers. That world needs that kind of help. And in truth, most of the people using low-code systems, even though a lot of companies espouse citizen development, the people using low-code are professionals who just find that they can get more done more quickly by using low-code instead of writing code. But again, the ticking time bomb, even if you're a professional developer and you build something with low-code, a lot of the things you need to practice DevOps style thinking, even if you don't call it that, it's not in there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm really guessing here. It's also potentially an opportunity because it sounds like easier to guide people towards the right way to do something using tools like no-code tools than saying, hey, here's an editor, do what you want, right? Because that's a free run. If all I have is an editor, like text editor, I might write tests, I might not write tests, but theoretically, you could have a low-code solution that says, hey, this cannot be committed without a test.
Yes, you could.
In a way of forcing practices, right?
Correct. And yes, you absolutely could. And most low-code vendors don't. A few do. Again, it's not, nobody's the bad guy. I'm not trying to insult anyone. I'm just saying you focus on your priorities, and a lot of the time your priorities are dictated by what people are asking for. And most people are asking for easier construction, not easier lifecycle management. Part of the whole DevOps movement is getting people to want this. Because if you want to do DevOps, what to do becomes a lot more natural and obvious. But you need to get people to think about something more than creating the solution. It's curating the solution, for lack of a better word. Because it's more than management, it's more than governance, it's certainly more than development. Curation is the best thing I can think of. And getting people to think that way, a lot of things fall into place once you get people to care.
I wouldn't say care. I would say when people get burned. I think that many of the good processes and improvements happen. Nobody cares. Let's start with there. But people get burned. Bad things happen. And when bad things happen, we create processes. We adopt new tools. We advance, generally speaking. Sometimes we also move backwards. Sometimes because of something bad happening, somebody introduces a process that prevents anybody from being ever productive again. But still, being burned, feeling the heat is what helps.
I agree. Yeah, that's a really good point. We're focused on making sure that the application is actually a model. You make a modification to the model. The application itself updates immediately upon deployment. If you're developing in place, which is unheard of in the world of DevOps, it happens instantly. If you are developing in a stage deployment, at least dev, test, production, upon deployment, the change happens instantly, even on the running instances. In other words, a change does not disrupt work in progress. We're good at that. A couple of other people are good at it, really short list. But even if you aren't doing what we call instant change, there's still at least the notion of making it easy to push out an update and allow new instances of a workflow process or a business process execution to pick up those changes without disruption, without having to stop stuff and restart it. If you need to migrate something from one place to another, do you really need to kill everything that's in progress and restart it? Can you pick up known state and keep going? Do you lose any metrics or history when anything is moved from one place to another? These kind of things matter. It's not that measuring things, it's not that people don't get that. It's that Most low-code systems don't build it into the system. Or even if they do, you have to make a conscious choice to have your application provide metrics that you can use. There's nothing built into the plumbing in a lot of cases to provide metrics you could use without you doing work in your application logic to do so. There's nothing in the infrastructure to provide it. Again, a few people are doing a good job with this. Most everyone else, it's not that they don't care about testing and measurement, but if they do, you have to put that logic in your application, which of course makes that application a lot harder to understand if you're a fresh pair of eyes.
So where is low-code headed? We talked about years ago, 20 years ago, that was 4GL, that was
Right.
RAD, that was all those kinds of things. I still have those books on my shelf. It doesn't seem like it's changed a whole lot, except it's had some new lipstick put on it. Other than the technology, the underlying technology has changed, so we can do different things, but the concepts are still basically the same. Is there any foundational changes coming to low code based on the new technology that is starting to emerge?
Well, I don't want to, again, it would be unsporting to pat my own company on the back.
Go ahead.
All right, very quick thing. Webcom was built around a model-based engine. It's state machine-based for people that know what that means. And for people that don't know what it means, it just basically assumes an application is an ongoing relationship. It's going to be regularly changed. So thinking through in advance, all of these housekeeping things like emitting telemetry, like providing an audit trail, like making history information and status information part of the running process, not something that's written off to the side in a glorified Post-it note. Just assuming the app is going to move, assuming it's going to be adapted, stopped, restarted, reconfigured on a regular basis. And so if you assume an application is going to be changed, you don't do things like creating a lot of hard-coded components. What you definitely don't do is what RAD did back in the day, which is generate code. Basically have a model, and you have an application execution engine that keeps checking the model to see what it's supposed to do next. Now, what I don't think anyone in low code has figured out is this notion of concentric rings. The idea of deploying an application to a subset of users to test it in the wild, and then expanding it to a larger ring of users, and then a larger ring of users with successive sets of field testing. I'd like us to get there, but I take comfort in the fact that the only time I've seen somebody doing work like that is in the actual world of actual code. But short of that, we're really good at this. The idea of deploying an application from one location to another, adapting just the changes, being able to roll it back if anything goes wrong, being able to test it at several points to make sure it behaves. And again, what to do if something misbehaves. If you discover a problem and then you fix it immediately, did you lose all the work that happened to date, or can you just pick it up where you left off? We can do that. And I don't think our team, Webcom's been around 15 years, founded by 4 very clever people. The CEO is a developer and still has a very active hand in what the product does at heart. I think he cared about all of this. I don't think he called it DevOps at the time. He wanted to create a low-code solution that was focused on what consultants needed, because users change their requirements constantly. So it was focused on change management and communication with stakeholders. And a lot of other stuff just fell into place. The fact that it happens to mirror a lot of the principles behind DevOps is, to me, a happy accident, but I'm really glad that accident took place.
Now, one thing with low code, that just thinking about professional coders versus your citizen developers, the thing that just doesn't click for me yet is, how can a low-code solution actually fit into a large company where compliance and governance actually is a thing? Because if anybody can basically spin up an Excel spreadsheet and make it production,
yes,
to me that's the classical low-code solution.
It is.
I don't. There's no way you could put that under any type of compliance type thing.
Well, you're right.
Or is there a way to do it?
Well, what has happened is most of the action in low code has been around either data management solutions or automation solutions, process solutions. And in both of those cases, The focus is less on making a spreadsheet better and more of creating something where you drag and drop what you want. So there will be some sort of development or design environment in which you have something that looks like a flowchart. And the flowchart is the application, or at least that's the only way you can see it. You might need to open up some of the elements in the flowchart to see how they're configured. But at the very first step, you aren't asking somebody to dive into a spreadsheet and look underneath all the formulae. Instead, you are looking at a flowchart and attempting to figure out what's going on. It's a little easier than the cacophony of random spreadsheets. It's still pretty hard. Yeah, it is.
What about security?
Some environments are better about it than others. Some of them provide particular roles and allow different people to do different things within an application. And in fact, they provide places in the configuration dialogues for you to specify all of that. Sometimes you have to code it into your application. A lot of low-code stuff cuts corners on that front. Again, if I'm going to say something critical, I don't necessarily want to call anyone out, but a large software company that is pushing something and claiming it's for citizen development as an application model that essentially assumes that the user has permission to touch all sources. In other words, it's not about contracts between groups. It's about, hi, I'm the application builder, and I'm going to use an account that magically has the right to do everything it needs. Or I think about maybe controlling security at the data source level. So who can run my automation? That's one sentry point or one choke point to prevent people from doing the wrong thing. But the only other choke point is I might classify this connector that talks to Salesforce.com as an enterprise connector, and I might restrict the ability of a personal data connector to talk to an enterprise connector. Or I might have a short list of people that are allowed to use enterprise connectors. But the shortcut most environments take these days is I've got a flow charter of some sort, and I might have a form painter, an empty canvas that I drag controls onto and bind them to data. And then I have connectors for maybe dozens or hundreds of pre-written things. And the idea being sold is that you can snap an application together like Lego bricks. And one Lego brick might magically connect to SAP, and another one might magically connect to, say, Microsoft Dynamics CRM or something like that, or your favorite human resources management system. But the mindset that it's just a question of connecting to an API ignores the fact that there's a whole layer of governance and security in talking to that resource in the first place, or that there are people guarding that resource. You might want to think of them as hoarders or information priests, but you also might want to think of them as caretakers that are making sure they're used correctly and responsibly. I generally think they're the good guys, not the bad guys, but they can be stodgy. But the point is, your SAP person doesn't want a low-code developer just randomly calling BAPIs and RFCs without knowing what it is they're doing. So the notion of just grabbing a connector and then being allowed to do whatever you want, that's an abomination to enterprises. So yeah, fine-grained security, most people don't do it very well. Few do.
At what point does it make sense to take an existing low-code solution and turn it into what I'm going to call real code solution?
Some of them are designed for that. In fact, but most of the new stuff would not be. The older stuff, some 4GL, absolutely rad type stuff, because rad usually started out looking like a prototype, and then you'd hit a button and it would emit a bunch of code, and from that point on, you were working in code land. There are a few people that do that today, but it's not the norm. You might offload some parts of your application into reusable components, and you might code those. That's generally the strategy these days for what you're talking about, Darren.
To be honest, I would like to see maybe in the future, not necessarily today, the other way around. Because a significant part of code today is not really critical that I just wrote a new algorithm that is doing something better than others. It is just repetitive work.
Yeah.
That could theoretically be a good candidate to become one way or another low code. So precisely so that those hardcore developers should be able to focus more on what matters. I mean, everything matters. That was the wrong word. But, where you're really breaking the boundaries of something, doing something that haven't been done before. To me, that's almost the same as automation. I want to automate the repetitive tasks because that's faster, easier, but above everything, so that I can focus on other things. And I could theoretically see the code going that way as well. Hey, all that repetitive, we are all doing the same. Move to something easier.
Yeah. The trend is exactly the opposite, which is to grab pieces and turn them into code. But I like the way you think, because again, if we turn them into low code, and it's the right kind of low code, being able to look at it, crawl inside the head of the original developer, and then figure out how to adapt it, because our needs have changed a little bit, that would be really, really helpful. Because code is ultimately text. We have text-based methods of looking for where the changes are that work pretty well, reasonably well. And we have version control that's focused on text manipulation that works reasonably well. And we've got profiling that, again, is based on text processing that works reasonably well. When your assets aren't text, it's not so much that they aren't code, it's that they're not text. Very few companies have come up with, okay, how do we analyze your application to figure out what the dependencies are? How do we analyze your application to figure out where the difference is between the version you just created and the version currently in use out there? The underlying trick to a lot of what we do in code land is we're text manipulating or manipulating text. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I'm just saying we don't have the equivalent of that when your application model is a lot more abstract and decidedly not text. It is a challenge.
Challenges are good.
Challenges are good, yes. Like I said.
That's how we make business. By solving challenges, not by solving the things others solved.
Correct. My crew is trying to do its part by making, everything is not text, but everything is absolutely a model. You always know where dependencies are because the model is basically an application is organized data. And so, yes, we know where the references are from place to place quite automatically. And we do comparisons that way by having a version history of virtually everything. It's not the text manipulation technique, so it's an attempt to come up with a different way of doing the same things. I don't think anybody has come up with it in a way I find delightful. There are a few people that have come up with a way that do it that I find sufficient or adequate.
So all of Mike's contact information will be down in the show notes. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.